can't find nothing on the radio.
You ready, Steve?
Welcome to Songology. He's Bruce,
He's Richard.
and this is another episode from our Song of the Day archives.
Enjoy.
Welcome back, Bruce. It's a new week. What do we have on tap for the short week?
Well, for the short week, I have firstly a bit of a musical quiz for you.
Oh, no.
Oh, you know how I love to give you musical quizzes.
Well, you call them quizzes. I call it torture.
So, here is something, and you can guess what instrument this is. Okay, you ready? Go.
Okay. Is that early organ that was actual audio tape in there and hitting a note?
Indeed.
I have no idea what it was called, but...
The very same. So, part marks from the judges.
Okay.
That is a mellotron.
A mellotron. Okay.
Yes, back in the late 60s, there was none of this newfangled fancy pants synthesizer stuff. They had to do stuff the old-fashioned way, right?
With audio tape.
With audio tape, exactly. And the mellotron was this weird little instrument. I thought, okay, well, let's, we got a short week. Let's do a little bit of mellotroning. That, of course. Now, you recognize the opening of that song?
The Beatles?
Indeed. It is a Beatles song.
Do I know the name?
You can't remember the name.
I can't remember the name.
It's Strawberry Fields Forever.
Okay, yep.
Which is one of, if not the first song to be released that used a mellotron. They got one of the first ones. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the mellotron. The story starts back in the late 50s at some point. I'm not exactly clear when. There was a guy by the name of Bill Franson, and he was in California. He was kind of a jack of all trades. He'd done a lot of different things, including, oddly enough, he was a uranium prospector for a while. But he was working as a window cleaner. And so he goes out to this customer's place to work on all the windows. And while he's cleaning the windows on this home and so forth, he hears these really weird and interesting noises coming from the garage. So he goes through and cleans the window and then has a look. And he sees this contraption that sort of looks like a keyboard, but it's got all of these goofy tape loops hanging off of it. And so the fellow is in the garage. He goes in and introduces himself. The fellow in the garage was named Harry Chamberlain. And what he had done was he had invented this contraption, more or less, that used pre-recorded tapes mounted inside a keyboard. And so basically when you pressed a key, the tape head engaged and played the tape. And so theoretically, you could have any sound you ever wanted. So Franson thinks that this is really quite cool. And he and Chamberlain kind of hit it off. And so he ends up that he's going to be Chamberlain's salesman. And Chamberlain has patented this thing and we'll make our millions kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
Now, it didn't really work very well, though. The Chamberlain version was called the Chamberlain Music Master. That's what he called it. And it didn't work very well because the electronics were bad and the tape guides were goofy, and it also had this horrible hum, which sort of sounded like feedback. It just really wasn't working very well.
Yeah.
So they're still working on this, trying to do different things. But if you fast forward to 1962, Franson is looking around to get new matched tape heads. They're going to have another batch at this.
Yeah.
And he gets hooked up with a company in the UK called BradMatic. They were really, really good. It was a small electronics company, but they were in Birmingham. They were well known for making really, really accurate tape heads. And so he places an order with BradMatic for 70 matched tape heads.
Uh-huh.
And they're naturally curious because nobody buys 70 at a time.
Yeah.
What are you doing with these things? And they end up discussing what's going on, and Franson explains to them this Chamberlain Music Master that doesn't really work. Well, the folks at BradMatic are very, very interested. It's a family called Bradley, and they start working on their own version of this thing. Franson joins them in the UK. They can't really pull it off because they don't have the money.
Yeah.
So they get a hold of a guy by the name of Eric Robinson, who was a band leader and also a radio broadcaster. He had the money, so he was the money, and Franson and Bradley's were the technical expertise, and they were the ones that perfected the Mellotron. So Franson was actually the guy who came up with the name. It was from mellifluous electronics, if you can believe that. It was mostly, like, the idea was kind of like the Chamberlains, but a whole bunch of the electronics were different. They had an aluminum chassis, and the mechanisms were considerably different. And they created the first version, the Mellotron Mark I, was in 63. It was 64, 65 by the time that they got the playable Mark II, and it was really the one that started to take off. They had a quieter motor, their electronics were transistorized by this time, and so it was getting better. It ended up looking like an organ to look at it. It had two keyboards. You know how on an organ the keyboards are sort of stacked a bit, offset and stacked?
Yeah.
The Mellotron keyboards were on the same level but split. And so you had the upper end stuff with your right hand, and then your left hand had a choice of effects or the bass line.
Right.
And there was all sorts of different tapes that were available for these things. And they thought, oh, this is really wonderful. This is the greatest thing. And you could do things with the pitch and bend the sound around a little bit. So it was really quite the thing. And everybody and their dog wanted to have one, including the Beatles. What you can hear, though, in the opening of Strawberry Fields, is the Mellotron flute effect. And you can hear it's kind of sounds a little warbly. You know, it's sort of the sound wobbles a little bit. That wasn't really so much an effect as it was. That's the way they sounded.
Okay. It's a feature.
Yeah, it's an undocumented feature that after a while the tapes would get a little wobbly and a little goofy if you didn't know how to keep the machine in perfect running order. And there was one guy who had a Mellotron, not John Lennon, but a different fellow who we'll come to tomorrow, who was the guy as far as Mellotrons go, but he had a really unique set of skills. So Lennon was quite taken with this thing. McCartney was quite taken with the Mellotron. In fact, I believe still has one, even now. This Mellotron, the one that you hear in Strawberry Fields, is allegedly now in the possession of Trent Reznor, who is the guy from the band Nine Inch Nails, if you're interested in that. The song, Strawberry Fields, John wrote in the fall of 66. He was in Spain for a while because he acted in a film. We always think of the Beatles in Help and Hard Day's Night and so forth. But John Lennon was also in a movie called How I Won the War. And he wasn't playing a Beatle. He was a different character.
Yeah.
The film didn't become terribly famous other than, this is John Lennon's other movie. So John was feeling a little isolated, feeling a little cut off from everybody because he was off in Spain. He and his wife were off there. And started thinking about his past and his history and so forth. So he thought about Strawberry Fields because Strawberry Fields is actually a real place. It's a Salvation Army home in Liverpool. It was a home for orphans. And John used to go and hang out there. It was not far from John's Aunt Mimi's place. You may remember that John's mom died when he was very young, as I recall. And John ended up having to go live with Aunt Mimi. And so he started out living actually in or near Penny Lane, believe it or not. So he moves in with Aunt Mimi in the suburbs, and it was a really nice place. It wasn't sort of the poor working class place that's projected in a lot of the Beatles material. John describes it himself in an interview. He described it as being about half a class higher than where Paul, George, and Ringo were living, because they were living in government subsidized housing.
Right.
Aunt Mimi had her own place. They had a little yard, and Paul's place, George's place, they didn't have anything like that. But not far away was Strawberry Fields, was sort of a combination boys' reformatory and an orphanage. And John used to go and hang out there with the other kids because he kind of felt a little bit orphaned in the sense that he was away from his parents and so forth. Now, Aunt Mimi was not real big about John going to Strawberry Fields, and they would often argue about that. And when the fights would break out and so forth, John would often say apparently to his Aunt Mimi, "What are they going to do? Hang me?" Which is where the line "nothing to get hung about" Strawberry Fields come from.
Yeah.
John said that the second line, "No one I think is in my tree," what he was trying to say was nobody seems to be as hip as I am, therefore either I'm crazy or I'm a genius, sort of thing. So now, do you want to know the dangerous thing about Strawberry Fields?
What's the dangerous thing?
Well, if I tell you this and you actually break it down, you'll never hear the song the same way again. So fairly
Fire
well.
away.
Okay. They made 2 different versions with different instruments, and they spliced it together to make one song. And John Lennon apparently couldn't decide which of the 2 versions to release, and so he said to George Martin, the producer, look, just put them together, because he liked the first part of the one and the rest of the other.
Yeah.
And so Martin is really quite taken aback by these instructions because the 2 versions were in different keys and they were recorded at slightly different tempos. But he figured out that if he sped up the first part and slowed down the second part, he could get a rough match.
Uh-huh.
And so where the edit is exactly 59 seconds in between the words. So he goes, let me take you down 'cause that's the edit point. And then it goes going to Strawberry Fields. That's where the splice are together. Martin hated the edit. He was not happy with it at all. But John said it was good enough. Though the story goes that much, much later, in the late 70s, John Lennon met up with George Martin and they were having dinner, yakking about the old days, etc. And John remarked that, I'd like to go back and re-record every single thing that the Beatles did. To which Martin responds, even Strawberry Fields? And John says, especially Strawberry Fields.
Uh-huh.
So, also I can tell you that this was the first popular song that faded to silence and then came back, which used to drive you DJ types nuts.
Yeah.
And there's another weird instrument on it. George played something called a swarmandal, which is an Indian instrument. It looks kind of like a zither, but people say it sounds like a harp.
Okay.
Now, I can't tell you what exactly, where exactly that shows up, but it's in there somewhere, trust me.
Okay.
So, having said that, let's fire up the Mellotron, the somewhat temperamental and hard to get along with Mellotron, and go down to Strawberry Fields.
And as usual, I have to stop it right there due to the wonderful world of fair use rules. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe. You can visit us on Facebook or head over to our website, songology.ca. Now, here's your chance to listen to the music or go on to the next episode.